Welcome to part one of a 15-part series as we journey through The Shining and into the Overlook Hotel with Stephen King. This video is over chapters 1 through 4 and what happened in these chapters. We open with Jack Torrance interviewing for a post taking care of the Overlook Hotel during the season where it is to be closed, or dead, as we might say. Mr. Ullman is the manager, and he does not trust Jack. Jack is interviewing on a recommendation from a Mr. Shockley. You see, the last guy who had the job and brought his family murdered them and then killed himself. He also had a drinking problem. Jack does not have a drinking problem, at least not anymore. Still got the temper, though, it seems. And we are looking at this all through Jack's perspective, and he is, even in his interview, getting testy with Mr. Ullman. He does have that temper, and it is the same one that lost him his previous job as an English teacher. All those sins aside, Mr. Ullman is taking Mr. Shockley's advice and hiring Jack. Then we find Wendy, Jack's wife, at home with their son, Danny. Turns out Jack doesn't just have anger problems at work. He brings them home with him. And he is terrible, it seems, at times, with his son. He's a nightmare for all those involved. Danny, however, loves his old man, and he is waiting for him to come home from this interview, despite the fact that Wendy explains to him that it will be a while. Danny remains unperturbed. Chapter 3 gives us Watson, who is a maintenance man at the Overlook Hotel, giving Jack a tour of the basement level of the Overlook. We're going to want to remember what this place looks like later. During this, he conveys the story of an older woman who stopped into the Overlook Hotel for a few days while courting a younger man who hung her out to dry. So she OD'd, as it would seem, on sleeping pills while in the bathtub. That woman who OD'd on those sleeping pills, that older woman, then went on to haunt or appear as a ghost to a cleaning lady. But Watson doesn't believe any of that, no matter how many people die in the Overlook Hotel. Dum dum dum, dot dot dot. The fourth chapter finds us in the head of Danny Torrance, the world's strongest man who happens to have a habit of sleeping on the corners of sidewalks. Only, he's not the world's strongest man, he's 5 years old, and he is not falling asleep, he's slipping into the Shadowland, where he then plays with his invisible friend Tony while previewing the future. Stephen King. Tony shows him some things at what we will learn, at what we know to be, but Danny does not yet know to be, the Overlook Hotel, including a red rum scene and someone chasing him with a mallet that looks suspiciously like the mallet in his old man's passenger seat when Jack returns home. But that's okay, because not everything Tony shows him always ends up coming true. ... So, what are we looking at with this story? If this is your first time on the channel, I try to do some talk about literature here, and I also try to do some talk about themes and things like that, the literary consequences in something, the symbolism within a story. But I think I would also like to take the time to, with this series at least, talk about some writerly stuff as well, as I believe Stephen King is one of those writers that is still left publishing. Not many people are publishing, and a lot of the mass publishing that we see seems to be the product of a factory, basically. But not so with Stephen King. And one of the interesting things that Stephen King does in the horror genre is he is constantly seeding our minds with the ideas of things, with the very language that he uses, such as on the very first page here. Stuart Ullman, people would mistake Stuart Ullman for the local undertaker. There's no reason to use the symbol of an undertaker other than the fact that it's planting this creepy, crawly, scary, or nasty idea in your head. A little bit later on, the hotel has changed ownership hands several times since World War II. No one has positive associations with World War II, I don't believe. So simply by planting that little idea in your head, you're in some place nasty. You're in some place terrifying. You're in some place bad. This is something that Shirley Jackson also did a lot in her writing, where she would be constantly planting little ideas that are lurking around in the back of your head while your eyes and your mind simply scan through. So while you're reading about the Overlook Hotel, the idea of World War II is just hanging out in the back of your mind. Later on in the same paragraph, chambermaids say they have heard rustling noises. Now, what might a rustling noise be? When you're already in a Stephen King book, you've got several possibilities, right? Later on in the same paragraph, we're invoking rats, which are creepy crawlies. Later on still, Ullman says that the attic is full of junk furniture and God knows what else. A little bit later, let's see, I've got them all sort of highlighted here. Jack said gravely, "The winters are fantastically cruel. We also run in the red." Sure, run in the red is a business term. There is no need to express the fact that the Overlook Hotel runs in the red with Jack Torrance, the guy who's supposed to run the heater and replace shingles during the winter months. There's no need to tell him that you run in the red, other than the fact that running in the red plants ideas in your reader's mind. We also get this: during our first winter, I hired a family instead of a single man. There was a tragedy, a horrible tragedy. So these are all things that keep going on. Just pay attention to the vocabulary that Stephen King is very, very particular to use, that he is sure. Ullman said he would have hired, no, this is Watson speaking about Ullman, he would have hired the Boston Strangler if he'd have worked for minimum wage. Again, one of these little things that just plants the idea of the creepy crawly in your mind. And in these 4 chapters, just these first 4 chapters, we've already got an introduction to the 4 main characters of the story. Now, if you have read these, you might be thinking to yourself, does Ullman stay for the winter? Does Watson come back? No. We're talking about Jack, the father, Wendy, the mother, Danny, the son, and the Overlook Hotel itself. In proper Southern Gothic style, the Overlook itself is a character in this piece. So it is interesting to set things up as such. And we already have quirks for each of them. Stephen King is very good with characterization. One example of that is here on page 17. Shit is a vulgar word. Nice people don't say it. And Wendy is saying to Danny, shit is a vulgar word. Nice people don't say it. Well, Dad says it, which is a little moment that tells us a lot about everyone involved. One, Wendy is someone for whom shame is a real thing. She doesn't want her son cussing, and she wants to give this little speech immediately. 2, it tells us about Danny. It tells us that Danny is a very observant person, and that rules might be secondary if he can squirrel around them. 3, it tells us that Jack really does come home with that with that sense of anger, that he really is not afraid to curse in front of his son. His son is picking up on these things. Another small thing, by the way, I skipped it when we were talking about seeding the ideas of the creepy crawly, the nasty, and the dangerous, the scary throughout this. And it's something that would be easy to overlook if you didn't look at the nomenclature involved itself. What does Jack drive? Jack drives a bug. His car is a bug. And we're going to come back to that bug a little bit later because of some of the other things involved here. But I want to touch on one more thing that has symbolism before we get to colors, wherein we will come back to the bug. Numbers. Numbers often have associations with them as well. And one of the things that you have to notice is you have to notice when a number comes up that is notorious for meaning something, or when a number comes up and comes up and comes up again. We have both of those in the number 5. Danny is 5 years old. Ullman appears to be 5'5". There are 5 levels of floor plans. And what is 5? In Christianity, man is 5, the devil is 6, and God is 7. So anytime that we're looking at the number 5, and it is given to us over and over and over again, it seems, meant to plant something of, if not futility, if not the futility of man, at least the fact that man is able to be flawed. Second, on page 5 here, we get this exchange. The Overlook has 110 guest quarters, he said in a scholarly voice. 30 of them, all suites, are here on the 3rd floor. 10 in the West Wing, including the presidential suite. 10 in the center, 10 more on the East Wing. All of them command magnificent views. A little bit later, he's still speaking of the Overlook Hotel, Ullman that is. 40 rooms, Ullman said, 30 doubles and 10 singles. And on the 1st floor, 20 of each, plus 3 linen closets on each floor. And a storeroom in which at the extreme east of the hotel on the 2nd floor and the extreme west end of the 1st floor. Questions? So we get a lot of numbers there. A lot of numbers thrown at us over and over again. One of them being 3. 3rd floor. 3 this, 3 that. I can't remember exactly the examples there. But the number of 3 is being planted in our mind. 3 obviously being the Trinity, also being protection, but 3 can also be representative of, if not Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, beginning, middle, and end. So being the conclusion as well. 10 is planted in our minds. 10 is change or wholeness in some interpretations. But I think some of the more interesting numbers that are thrown around here are the numbers 30, 40, and 110. 30 might mean tolerance or expression. But in Christianity, it is also representative of sacrificial blood, as Judas turned in Christ for 30 pieces of silver. And a little bit later, the old lady who killed herself, it seems, overdosed on 30 sleeping pills. Another number that we get is prominent here, 40 rooms, 40, 40, 40. 40 in Christianity, well, classically it is challenge or tribulation. In Christianity, it is also for trials and tribulations, tests, wandered through the desert for 40 years, 40 days and 40 nights, these types of things. But the one that I had to look into, that I wasn't sure why we were getting 110 and 110 over and over again. There's 110 guest quarters, there's also 110 full-time employees. Joseph and Joshua both died at 110. That was something I was not aware of. So it is another number pointing towards doom, it seems. While we are talking about classic symbolism, let's look a little bit about the colors involved here. And this is something that I had done a little bit of work on in my undergrad. I had a pop lit class in which we were assigned The Shining, and I wrote my paper on it. I'll be damned if I remember the conclusion I came to, but it seems that there is something to be done with the color schemes involved here. I think that there is something to be made of hot versus cold colors, as well as natural versus artificial type colors. Not a lot of gray in nature. Man-made things are pretty fond of the color gray. And I think that there's something clinical about gray, something cold and distant about gray. So we're going to look at that whenever it comes up. Ullman is wearing a gray tie, which classically a gray tie means a position of authority, but also gray, like I said, is a very cold and distant color. But let's look predominantly here at the color red. We've got a lot of red going on. There is a mention of a red cloud of rage that comes over Jack. Ullman is wearing a red carnation, whereas with the carnations, light red means admiration, dark red means love and affection. Classically, I don't think that's where Stephen King is going at all. I think that it is a hot color, and that is why we are mentioning it. And because we also have that mention of the red cloud of rage, also blood, we know that blood is red. So we're going to want to take a closer look at the color red as we journey through the Overlook Hotel. But also, Jack drives a red bug. It should be noted. Not only is his car a creepy crawly bug, it's also red. So that is interesting to note going forward. On to some smaller notes before the last real big thing that I want to talk about. On page 8, we get a list of presidents that have stayed in the Overlook Hotel. Those presidents are Wilson, Harding, Roosevelt, and Nixon. Franklin Roosevelt died in office. Nixon was impeached. Woodrow Wilson entered World War II and suffered a stroke, a massive stroke that affected the rest of his life while still in office. And Harding died in office as well. So even there, we have these little nods towards something bad coming. Pardon me. One other small thing, they live on Arapahoe Street, do the Torrances, and the most famous leader of the Arapahoe tribe was a man named Little Raven. I do not know if this is going to come back up. I don't remember that much about this novel. It's been nearly 10 years since I've read it. But the idea of the Raven is something that is very hallowed in the pages of horror fiction. And ravens are also noted for being very intelligent creatures, and creatures that are, when you look at them, they're looking back at you. And while you've got thoughts about them, they're returning those thoughts about you. So there is something to be seen behind those black glass eyes of theirs. So I think that is something else to be noted there. And on page 19, a little bit over halfway down, we have the first appearance of Wendy having a parenthetical thought. And that theme of the parenthetical thought is something that will pop up time and again in this novel, and it's something to keep an eye on. It's something to really concentrate on what is going on there, because like I said, I want to get into a little bit more of the writerly type stuff with this series. That's a very interesting formula for giving us someone's thoughts, because the parenthetical thoughts often pop up in the middle of italicized thoughts. So the main thought is sometimes he does things he's sorry for later. That is a congruent thought coming to us from Wendy. Sometimes he's thinking of Jack. Sometimes he does things that he's sorry about later. Instead, the way it's broken down is sometimes, parenthetical thought, Danny with his arm in a cast, unparentheses, he does things he is sorry for later. That is, again, something that I think is very practical, and yet still fairly subversive to be done by King in this novel, in that we are getting something that is a thought within a thought, but it's very easy and obvious to track on the page, as opposed to something like William Faulkner, where those thoughts just run on and on and on, and as opposed to someone like Ernest Hemingway, for example, whose characters have direct thoughts all the livelong day. So it is interesting to see that. Moving forward, on page 27, something else that is a small thought that I thought would be interesting to look at. Watson. And a lot of times in fiction, and I think especially in Stephen King, from my experience with King, which is fairly limited, but not all for naught, we will get minor characters that are seemingly throwaway, that bestow some of the most profound wisdom of the piece, because they are necessary in that way as not to make the piece too on the nose. So Watson here, while speaking to Jack, he uses the phrase, "a man can't help his nature." A man can't help his nature. That's something with which we will be tested, I think, throughout this entire book. A man can't help his nature. What is a man's nature? From whence does that come? When do we know it? At what point is it too late to change? Are we born into the nature that we will have? Are we born into circumstances that will conflict us for all of our life, despite the fact that we may or may not be aware of them? But the final thing I want to talk about, the elephant in the room, happens in that final chapter, Danny's chapter, where we learn about the Shadowlands. One of the interesting things going on in Danny's section is the close psychic distance of his narration. It is third person, but we are very close to Danny's head. We are seeing things through Danny's point of view. And we know that Danny knows a lot of words the average kid would not. We even know that he conceptualizes these words as words. Two of the big ones that we are introduced to here are divorce and suicide. And these are words that Danny stumbled upon in his parents' minds. When he enters the Shadowlands, he is able to, it seems, travel across space and time and enter the head of someone else. And in that final chapter, we hear about the word divorce, which has crept around in both his mother and his father's minds, and the word suicide, which has crept around in his father's mind. Now there is, and it creeps around as a word. He is able, it seems, to conceptualize the word suicide. And there is something with which I am not quite familiar called Worfianism, and I will try to brush up and read a little bit about this as the series goes on, in order to talk about this in some intelligent way, if possible, for me, which is that the Worfianism is that the structure of language affects the speaker's views. And this is, for me, on a base level, sort of easy to conceptualize. When someone says a car, what do they mean? Do they mean simply a sedan? Most commonly, if someone says a car, we think of a sedan, because if it were not a sedan, we would say a van or a truck. if in the language we did not have delineations for van and truck, all of those things would be represented when someone says a car. So if I were to say I want to buy a car, you would have no idea whether I meant a van or a truck or a sedan or a Cybertruck or whatever that might be. So I think that it is something worth thinking about going forward. How is it that Danny invades these minds that he goes into? How is it that Danny is able to conceptualize the things that he conceptualizes through this book? Why would he be introduced to the word suicide in his father's head versus that feeling of helplessness and denial of the use of going on? Where is it that in someone's mind that word pops up? Which is simply in fictions one of the most interesting things for me, being someone who grew up with something like the X-Men. I have always wondered, when Professor X reads someone's mind, what is that? At what point are you reading someone's mind versus seeing through their eyes? Where is that dichotomy? There is a lot of studies done that show we believe we are an individual, we believe we are a person, and if we had to really spatially conceptualize where we are, if I had to say where I am, it is generally somewhere slightly behind the eyes. That's where I feel most of me resides. How does that work with something like mind reading? But that is all I have for this episode, episode 1 of 15, roughly pages 1 through 50 of The Shining. And I hope to have you back here for episode 2, which will be chapters 5 through 7 and pages 50 through 82.